Welcome back to my channel. This is going to be part 2 of my robe inspired by The Great on Hulu. Check out part 1 if you missed it. This is the garment I was inspired by in the show and will be attempting to recreate. Starting off, this is what we left off on part 1. The main body of the robe was complete and I felt like I was wearing a trash bag, a beautifully fabriced trash bag, but it was just not very flattering at this point, but I just moved on to the sleeves anyway. Looking at the sleeves in the show, they go almost to the wrist and they're slightly belled. I had nothing to base these on because the pattern I was sort of looking at had more fitted sleeves, and I didn't want to use them anyway, so I googled the basic shape for a bell sleeve and decided to just try using that as a mock-up, and by some miracle the first sleeve I drew out sort of kind of worked, so I just went with it. One should definitely use a French curve when drawing sleeve shapes like this, but I didn't have one, so I just YOLO'd it and drew it out, and for the bottom of the sleeve I just left it straight for now. When thinking about how these need to be constructed, it was hard for me to wrap my head around because they want to be a belled shape at the end, but there will be pleating at the top. So the sloping of the sleeve is actually bigger at the top than at the bottom. Before wasting the mock-up fabric, I tried to imagine what the final shape would be like using just the pattern piece. I also started doing this with a tiny paper cutout of the pattern when I was trying to come up with the general shape before, just to make sure that in the end it would be slightly belled. For the mock-up fabric, this is just some cheap muslin from Joann's, and I didn't even pin the pattern piece down. But for this, I will just pin this into the garment that's been constructed already to get an idea of what the sleeve shape will look like when finished. So with the mock-up sleeve pinned into the arm side with a couple pleats, I was actually really happy with the shape, and the ease of which I made the sleeve is definitely balanced out by the struggles to come with the final sleeve. I started the final sleeve with the exterior fabric first and just sewed up the sleeve seam first and pinned it into the arm's eye and sewed that in place. No major catastrophes with the outer sleeve. Everything was lined up how it should, and I was happy with how these got set in. Now onto the lining fabric. I cut the same shapes out again and had to get really creative with piecing to get 2 of these cut out. That's all the fabric I had left. So I ended up having to piece some together to keep the sleeves cut on the right grain and just barely got them to fit. Now on to the by far hardest part of this entire project, the sleeve lining. So in the beginning, I just sewed in the lining sleeves the same as I did the outer sleeves, turned them inside the outer fabric, and thought all was fine, except for a small gap that I could sew up later. I did think it was odd that the outer fabric made a much longer sleeve than the lining fabric, and like an idiot, I actually trimmed down the outer sleeve to match like 3 inches. It was only once I tried on the sleeve that I realized something was not quite right, because the outer sleeve, when it was sewed in, fit just fine, so I knew something had to be off. I thought about how I inserted the lining, and I realized I put the sleeves in backwards. I was used to putting in sleeves where their final state is with the raw seam on the inside, like on the outer fabric, which is why it was fine. But for a lining, that is the opposite, and that the left sleeve needs to actually go on the right and the right sleeve needs to go on the left, so that when flipped inside out, the left is on the left and the right is on the right, which I did not realize. So the shoulder I actually put in the completely wrong place, which is why it felt tight, because it was rotated incorrectly and the extra bulk that should have been on the shoulder was actually in the armpit. This also explains why the lining was shorter than the outer fabric and why I should not have trimmed the outer fabric and made my finished sleeves shorter than they were supposed to be. So I reinserted them, and of course I couldn't do that right either, and I had them flipped the wrong way out. On the third try, I did get the sleeves inserted correctly, and this is how I finished them off. I ended up turning the raw edges in and just whip stitching the layers shut. If you want to learn anything from me, it is that you should always insert sleeves with the longest stitch possible, so that when you have to rip them out 3 times, you haven't completely destroyed your fabric like I kind of did in this endeavor. Now on to the issue of this being unflattering. I decided to make a belt, which was just a long strip that I sewed together. But I didn't want to compromise the back pleats, so I decided to cut holes for the belt to go under the pleats. And because this is polyester, I just got to melt the edges of what I cut to prevent fraying, and then cut a small bias tape out to finish the edges of those holes. And this is what a finished belt loop looked like once I got the bias tape in there. Because I had already thrown historical accuracy out the window with my belt, I decided I would also add pockets. These are my first ever pockets, and I didn't use a pattern or instructions and just winged it. I cut out a roughly hand-sized shape piece 4 times for the 2 pockets. I then zigzag stitched around all of the edges for the pockets as the way to finish them. Really, I probably should have used a French seam. That probably would have been easier, and I think that's what most people do for their pockets, but the zigzag stitch will keep that fabric from fraying just fine. I seam ripped open the long seams on the sides where I wanted the pockets to sit, and I just sewed in the pocket. I don't have any footage of that, but this is what the final result looked like when I pressed it, and I'm pretty happy, and they sit pretty flat, so you can't really see them when you have it on, which is what I was going for. As I said in the first video, I should have French seamed everything. Instead, I did it oops, I should have French seamed by turning in the raw edges together and whip stitching it all along the long seams after everything was sewed together, and this was including the arm size. To determine the hem, I made some marks while standing to give myself a starting point. I definitely wanted it to be above my ankles in the front so I wouldn't trip on it and die, which is another diversion from the inspiration. So I cut off the length that I wanted all the way around the hem, leaving it a bit longer in the back for maximum extraness, as I call it, but with it above my ankles in the front so I can walk with ease. I wanted to avoid the lining peeking out from the outer fabric, so I ended up hanging it up and trimming it shorter to make sure that once hemmed, the lining will always be shorter than the outer fabric. While it was hung up, I took some more detailed shots of what the finished neckline looks like and the pleats, and also what the belt looks like when I put the tie through the loops, and see how it goes directly underneath those Watteau back pleats to keep them in place when I have it belted up. For the actual hem stitching, I ironed in a pretty narrow hem of just turning over the fabric twice and pinning that in place. I then used a back stitch to secure this, sort of as a prick stitch. I tried to make it show as little as possible on the front of the fabric. As you'll see, these back stitches are pretty long, and I'm also holding it on the front side so that I can make sure that my stitch on the front is as short as possible, so it's basically invisible. For the lining, I just folded it over twice, ironed, and machine stitched that in place. And this is the final product in its more historically inaccurate version with the belt, which is the way I prefer to wear it, more comfortable. But it can also be worn more historically as pictured here. And I think in this version, it does look very similar to my inspiration piece, if not a little less well fitted, which just makes it more comfy. It's pretty heavy to wear because of all of the fabric on the back, but it makes it very fun to prance around your apartment in, and it makes me feel like a princess when I'm sitting on the couch in my beautiful brocade fabric watching Netflix, which is exactly what I was looking for. So thanks for watching, and I hope you like this, and maybe you'll be inspired to make one too.